There are two different issues that are bubbling up to the surface right now. One is how we ought to interpret the Second Amendment, and the other is how school officials in public schools should be handling students who are obviously right now much more vocal and involved in protest than I've ever seen students before. As to the Second Amendment, I think people need to be clear that, like every constitutional right, it is not without limits. The U.S. Supreme Court has said essentially that individuals, at least individuals who are competent to own a gun, they do have a right to have a handgun in the home for self-protection and protection of their families. But the court, in two cases called McDonald and Heller, which are the leading Supreme Court cases, has never gone farther than that. So it's an open question whether somebody has a right to own a weapon that's more lethal than a handgun. Obviously, when it comes to the weapons that have been used in some of these shootings, the weapon of choice seems to be something called the AR-15, which is a semi-automatic military-grade weapon that can be, with a bump stock, turned into an automatic military-grade weapon. There seems to be little question constitutionally that Congress or a state could place limits on the possession or use of that particular weapon, because that goes well beyond having just a handgun in your home to protect yourself or to protect your family. On the other hand, I think that opponents or maybe I should say proponents of gun control need to understand that the Supreme Court has said that it is an individual right independent of the militia clause in the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment says that a well-regulated militia being necessary to a free state, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. And so the argument goes that that right only applies to members of the militia. The Supreme Court has rejected that and said that individuals do have a right to possess a firearm, again, as long as they are competent to possess a firearm. So that's the Second Amendment component. As to schools, there is a lot that seems to be bubbling to the surface in a number of states with school officials grappling with how they're going to handle student protests. And I've seen one in particular, a superintendent from a public school district, who has sent a letter to parents saying that school district is not going to tolerate any quote-unquote protest, even, this superintendent said, if the protest is designed to increase awareness. Now, that's the kind of thing, as I talk to students and have been asking me about this in class, that's the kind of thing where I would imagine that a school attorney for a superintendent like that is on the phone with the superintendent saying, you need to come into line with constitutional principles. Here, of course, we're talking about the First Amendment. The U.S. Supreme Court has said that students do not shed their constitutional right to free speech at the schoolhouse gate. If students are speaking for themselves and not speaking for the school, they have a right to express their own opinions in a way that is not disruptive. So when a superintendent says, I'm not going to allow protests, first of all, that's an awfully broad term. Protest, we don't know what that means. And then goes further and says, I won't even allow quote-unquote protests that are designed to increase awareness. In my opinion, courts are going to look at that and say that is a very overbroad restriction on student speech. It's one thing for a school district to control what's in a student paper, because that's published under the school's name, or a yearbook, or something that is said at a school assembly or a commencement, something like that. Schools have a lot of leeway to control that speech. But schools do not have the authority to stop students from expressing themselves and their own thoughts in school. I've noticed that students in my classes at WMU Cooley have been really expressing a concern about not just the legal part of it, but also the political and social aspects of this debate, and wondering why it is that there seems to be such a feeling among so many people that Second Amendment rights sort of trump everything else. Obviously, one of the components of that is financial, the influence of special interest groups, and politicians who are beholden to those special interest groups. And when I talk to students about this, I try to kind of guide it back to the legal part, because I think there is a connection too, because I really think there is a misunderstanding about the scope of rights under the Second Amendment. No court, the U.S. Supreme Court, no court under the U.S. Supreme Court has ever said that the Second Amendment includes the right to have the kinds of weapons that, for example, sometimes you'll hear, I have the right to own a weapon so that if the government oversteps, I can overthrow the government. No court has ever endorsed that idea because, frankly, in the modern world, that would mean that individual citizens had a right to possess weapons of mass destruction. There's no way you're going to take down the government of the United States with a pistol or a rifle, when you're facing M1 tanks and aircraft carriers. So that is a very overbroad interpretation of what the Second Amendment protects. And again, it was actually Justice Scalia who said, a very conservative justice in one of these cases, that he was limiting his opinion to handguns in the home. So I always encourage students when they're discussing this in public to educate the public about what exactly the court has said about the scope of the Second Amendment. And in the hope, of course, that the more people understand it, the more we can have reasonable conversations. One of the problems is people talking past each other all the time, right? You have one side saying, well, you're trying to take away our guns, whereas I think that's kind of a straw man argument. Even these students that we're hearing from Parkland are expressly saying we don't want to take away everybody's guns. But as long as we have that posture where both sides think that the other side is out for a total victory, if you will, and that there's no flexibility, then we continue to have these debates, not just about guns, but about a lot of social issues where people are not talking to each other, they're just talking right past each other. So I'm hoping that law students and the lawyers that we send out from Western Michigan University Cooley Law School are contributing to this debate in an intelligent way. The best solution to this problem is probably a comprehensive one. And there again, we run into a problem where people kind of go to their corners and they stay there. There is obviously a mental health component to this, but it's a cop-out to say that mental health is the whole problem. After all, it won't do to say that somebody is insane when they shoot up a school, right? And then later say that person ought to be executed for what they did. Those are not consistent because we're not supposed to be executing people who are insane. So people have to watch out for the consistency of their arguments. But in addition to addressing mental health, maybe there are ways to make schools safer by posting armed guards and things like that in schools. But on the other hand, the idea that we should just flood schools with guns, teachers and school administrators with weapons, seems to me to be unwise. So if you would combine security of schools with mental health, with training of how to spot students, and obviously there's a lot of news out there that this particular student was sending up red flags everywhere, and reasonable controls on guns. When you have people arguing that we shouldn't even ban something like a bump stock, which again turns a weapon into a military-grade automatic machine gun. When people are staking out positions like that, there's nowhere to go. And so, my wish would be that we could have a comprehensive conversation about it that was free of all the money and all the special interests and all of the extreme positions. We have a very diverse student body here, and I think that our students are sort of picking up that kind of a conversation among themselves as well, and are inspired by those students. We're able to have discussions with regard to people from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, a variety of different ideas who come together and sort of and that's the nice thing about teaching here is people tend not to take extreme sides and not budge. We're in a much more thoughtful atmosphere than that. And so to have students from all these different backgrounds coming together and kind of listening to each other, I think they often leave with a perspective that they didn't come in here with. Again, I'm seeing that at a high school level, and I wasn't even aware that that kind of thinking was going on at the high school level, but it's bubbling up there, it's bubbling up here, and hopefully the level of dialogue that's going on in this country, we can all be inspired by the young people who are leading us at this point, whether it's in high school, college, or even in law school.